Hello, and welcome to the third episode of my podcast series, Researching LGBTQ+ people in development. As with the earlier episodes of this series, this aims to be a starting point towards better understanding and discussions of LGBTQ+ struggles in development. I am not an expert in this area, merely an LGBTQ+ development student who's exploring the current narratives and practices. I encourage you to do further research and engage with other conversations, particularly if these conversations come from the voices of people living in the Global South. If you are unsure of where to start, all my references are in the transcript for this episode, as well as some other useful resources on this topic. There is an assumption in development that we are saving LGBTQ+ people, that the West is forward-thinking and everywhere else is behind. But what we don't pay attention to is the diverse gender and sexual identities present long before colonisation, repressing their cultures. We are responsible for the decimation and criminalisation of the very people we now use in order to claim we are better than the Global South. In this context, language is very important. History has changed our use of language around gender and sexual minorities, going from what often was an unspoken, widely accepted part of life in the Global South that had no real need for labels, to the acronym of LGBTQ+, for the specific labelling of groups outside the cis mainstream. Western ideas of knowledge and language restrain and suppress the realities of the Global South. Development sees the heterosexual couple as the principal lifestyle of the Global South, but when they do recognise homosexual couples, unrealistic assumptions can be made. LGBTQ+ is a Western-created and Western-imposed term. Same-sex partners are often accepted as friends within family groups, or places may use completely different terms. For example, the Igbo people of Nigeria have a group called Ekwe, who are classed as female husbands who marry women. Hence, individuals who engage in non-heteronormative practices may not recognise themselves as being a part of the LGBTQ+ community. Alternatively, they might not be able to actively label themselves as such for fear of reprisals. Our Western imposition of labels could easily exclude this large group of people, but development programs can really struggle to recognise this. In Bolivia, an outreach program labelled as being aimed at homosexual men only worked for some of the MSM population. A large part of the MSM population in Bolivia did not self-identify as being homosexual. There was in fact a specific community who had wives and children, but would have sex with men on the side. Traditional development programs do not address this. Instead, they use Western words to, often incorrectly, sum up a population. Language use is incredibly important in this field, as using LGBTQ+ immediately brings a Western approach to the table. It can also often miss out large groups of people who do not identify with the acronym. This seemingly small decision by the development industry can make a big difference, though, due to the history of the Global South. The idea that one small action can have a big impact is talked about in this clip from Vice, in which they explain the impact of laws introduced in Britain on LGBTQ+ lives. The link to the video can also be found in the transcript for this episode.
But although gay sex stopped being illegal in the rest of the UK by 1982, the laws that forbid homosexuality are still in the penal codes of many of our former colonies. It's the reason why LGBTQ people in countries like Barbados, Pakistan, Guyana, Kenya, Ghana, and Singapore, where I'm from, still don't have equality today. Many of Britain's former colonies don't have histories of being hateful towards LGBTQ people. Basutu women in present-day Lesotho, Africa, still engage in socially accepted relationships with each other. They call each other their motswale, or special friend. Mwanga II, the 19th century king of what is now modern-day Uganda, had sex with men. until white missionaries brought Christianity to his kingdom and everyone changed their minds about their gay king. Britain literally exported hatred and homophobia to the countries it colonized. It's not like these laws just gather dust on the statute books. They continue to be used against LGBTQ people to this day. Between 2010 and 2014, almost 600 people were prosecuted under Kenya's anti-gay laws, according to official government figures. In 2010, 2 gay men were sentenced to 14 years hard labor in Malawi after being convicted of gross indecency and unnatural acts. They attracted the attention of the authorities after holding an engagement party. When the judge passed the sentence, he said he wanted to protect the public from people like you. In August 2018, 20 men were charged with illicit behavior after a raid on a gay club in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Uganda still actively persecutes gay people to this day. In November 2019, police raided an LGBTQ bar in Kampala, dragging out at least 120 people and arresting them and throwing them into the backs of vehicles. Because institutional homophobia runs deep in so many former colonies, some countries have chosen to keep these regressive laws in their penal codes. In March 2020, despite the best efforts of LGBTQ activists, a court in Singapore ruled in favor of keeping homosexuality illegal. Jamaica was once known as the most homophobic country on earth, with gay people being lynched by angry mobs into the 21st century. These days, we've mainly left it up to LGBTQ campaigners to sort out the trouble that the UK left behind. Would these countries be such difficult places for queer people if it wasn't for the British? Even former Prime Minister Theresa May doesn't think so. In 2018, she said she deeply regrets the role that the UK had to play in introducing these anti-gay laws to its former colonies. It's a nice gesture, although extremely belated. But saying sorry doesn't mean anything to the people who've had to live in fear and hiding, all because of their sexual orientation. Some sins you just can't apologize away.
Pre-colonization, native populations had very varied gender and sexual identities. Often these don't fit with westernized terms or categorizations. Of the populations we know about today, there are Two-Spirited Native Americans, Hijras from India, Gorjigen from Senegal and the Gambia, Yandodu from Nigeria, and Wobi from Côte d'Ivoire, just to name some examples, all of whom transcend Western binary definitions of gender. Varying gender and sexual identities are not a Western invention. We are the people who repressed them. Anti-LGBTQ+ policies were about control. Colonizers misused the various sexual practices and gender identities of populations in order to justify surveillance and policing of the local population. Colonizers used it as a defense for restricting movement in and out of the area, claiming it was protecting them from the dangerous customs and perverse behaviors of inhabitants. They would often use evangelical missionaries to civilize the native population through actions such as enforcing a heterosexual family model. As racial differences were sought out by colonialists, gender differences were erased, removing the stories and lives of people in order to fit their political agenda. Use of a rigid two-sex system removed any variation deemed as outside normal human biology, decimating the gender-diverse lives of native populations in the process. Colonizers turned what were acceptable behaviors in indigenous communities into the abnormal. They are, at least to a very significant extent, co-responsible for the intolerance of gender and sexual variations we continue to see. We need to realize the impact our history has had on and continues to have on native populations. Yet whilst we may see the policing of LGBTQ+ lives by the West as being something historical, it is still something seen today. The phrase global queering has been used by scholars to describe when Western ideas of sexuality and gender identity diffuse through the global South, predominantly due to transnational LGBTQ+ organizations. The West tends to see its mission to be transforming traditional societies to the Western capitalist form of modernity. seeing the Global South as if they are demanding rights already achieved in the West, and viewing organisations as helping the catch-up process. LGBTQ plus rights are used politically, weaponized against others in order to fit with the current agenda. Not only is this clearly a move used by the West to maintain their control, but it is an ineffective way of going about making change. Stemming from this Western judgment of the Global South, forcing them to make changes when they fail to protect LGBTQ plus rights, usually by withholding aid. We can see this in the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Trans Association's map of lesbian, gay and bisexual world laws. The map uses a traffic light system to depict the status of LGBT rights in the world. The problem is that it does this from a Western idea of sexual modernization, meaning that only certain types of rights and development is seen as actually being progress, and it's the Western idea and narrative that it conforms to. On the ILGA map, no European nor North American countries were in the reds or yellows. However, the majority of Africa and the entirety of the Middle East are red, orange or yellow. Although we are starting to wake up to the role the West plays in development, we are effectively ignoring huge areas of importance. It's time to discuss the impact of our actions and stop idly blaming the Global South for the consequences of the West. Development is based on neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is heteronormative. This is because the deinstitutionalization policies of neoliberalism mean social spending cuts. Under these cuts, the first thing to go are minority programs, with the focus tending to shift even more towards families. The exclusion of LGBTQ plus people from heteronormative nuclear families leads them to have to work much harder for their basic needs to be met. The weaker welfare states lead to high inequality rates and lower level working class wages, which deepens the level of heteronormativity felt in the developing world because of the much higher rates of poverty felt by LGBTQ plus people. Overt development assistance can also face backlash, such as Hillary Clinton's announcement of a $3 million in grants to advance LGBTQ plus rights in Africa, which some took as the West imposing its own values through money. Because of this lack of care or awareness for the West's involvement in the past, LGBTQ plus inclusive development policies can be very difficult to implement. Neoliberalism poses a real challenge for development. The policies massively impact minority groups who are already struggling to get access to healthcare and work. But the neoliberal view is not the only thing continuing to have a large impact on development. Christianity has always played a large role in the relationship between the Global South and the West. The Christian population in Sub-Saharan Africa increased from 9% of the population in 1910 to 63% in 2010. During colonialism, missionaries and colonial administrators policed African practices of sex, intimacy, and relationships as a way of reshaping their cultural values and meanings. The Christian religion has therefore played a large role in development during this time. Given the use of evangelical missionaries during colonialism, we can see how this boom in the Christian religion could be used to uphold anti-gender and sexual minority sentiments. The influence that religion has in the Global South is large, stemming from colonial rule. Christianity plays a large role in maintaining the anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric commonly found, with the West responsible for this through pushing religion in development programs. This is particularly true in the case of Christian aid organizations, who often use religion as a focal point for development. Western people and subsequently elites forced their idea of sexuality and gender upon local populations. Why then do we find it surprising they would resist another group of Westerners telling them how to experience sexuality and gender all over again, particularly if the past actions of Westerners aren't remedied by the new ones? Ignoring the impact of colonisers will neither be effective nor be listened to by the current inhabitants of the Global South. There is generational trauma there. We can't be shocked when leaders don't want to address LGBTQ+ rights. But LGBTQ+ people should be able to live their lives no matter the past faced by their country. The development industry needs to hold this in mind, rather than walking in with their imposed Western ideals and not addressing the impact we've historically had. In the current situation, we are using LGBTQ+ people as political pawns, a stick to bash others with, without really considering what is happening. We have so much more to do in order to understand the real impact we have had and continue to have by imposing our Western understandings and colonial roots to development. Instead of drawing arbitrary lines to keep control, we need an honest discussion on the impact of colonialism on sexuality and gender identity. Nothing will be solved until we face our past actions. Thank you for listening to this episode. In the next and final episode, I will talk about economics and healthcare. I cover the economy, poverty, discrimination, the job search, family, and healthcare. Regardless of whether you think economics and healthcare interest you, it is important to understand the struggles faced by LGBTQ+ people in development across the board. So give it a listen.